So Ms. Bullock, you have a seriously intriguing and interesting work, and I think people would gain a lot by reading this work. And so one of the things that I found most interesting was when you talked about Africans and African Americans being the descendants of the Egyptians, and you actually give us some scripture, and when you talk about how we were the enslaved people who were dispersed throughout the world. You want to expand on that for me?
Yes. Actually, you're correct in saying that Egypt itself is a word which is placed on us by the Greeks. I mean, first of all, if I had a way of describing us, I would not use the word Egypt. But since we were in that place and we were ancient Egypt, that's how they identify. Ancient Egyptians were the people who, before the Greeks named that land Egypt. Okay, right. That's number one. And so we were the Cushites, the Nubians, the Kemetians, if you would want to, but people have their own names. However, the scattering and dispersal of the people is also mentioned in prophecy. You can see that in biblical text. A lot of us read the Bible, and there are things in the Bible that we just don't go back, especially the Old Testament. Right. Basically, we are programmed through the New Testament. Most of our story is in the Old Testament. And as far as this book, our very past, buried, and everywhere around us, all through our lives, we see it. But it's still buried because intuitively we can't see it.
Right. Right. So I thought that was interesting how you could name the book Our Buried Past, because it's almost like you're suggesting that there's some things that's been buried, and almost like they were purposely kept from us. And so, yeah, so I think that was an interesting way to put that when you said a buried past, because you talked, so a lot of things you talk about have to do with that. So let me not, let me let you continue.
Yes. Yeah. What you say here is very well put together. We are a special people. I think even if we look at ourselves presently in 2022, we would see that there's something about us that remains unaddressed and also not quite put in the way that would make it understood. Our story, Black people in America, I'm going to go down to a little bit of what we hear about Black people in America, how they came and those, about the slave plantation. Some of us know more about and, emphasize more about the past. But my point is in Nile Valley, and I think that there's another person who has, quite a few people have done books, to say that Black Americans actually were the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians were the beginnings of the civilization, that the oldest people on earth.
Exactly.
We can record the beginnings of civilization. The oldest, most ancient were of African or Black descent, or whatever way we want to identify the people among whom I am born.
But one of the things I thought was very interesting was, it's interesting how when you look at the stories in the Bible, particularly with the Exodus and Moses and all that, and it's interesting how when people tell that story, they tell it from a certain perspective, and that perspective has to do with the perspective of the Hebrews, right? But when you go back and look at it from the perspective of the Egyptians or the Kemetians, then you can put this, it gives a different spin. So I thought you gave a serious different spin when you actually pull some of the scriptures out that kind of support your statement or your theses that the Egyptians or the Kemetians were the people who were dispersed all over the world, and some of that disbursement was done during the slave trade. So, for example, one of the scriptures that you use, and I'm going to read it, and it says, "And the Egyptians will I give over into the hands of a cruel lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts." And that's Isaiah 19:3. And this one here, which I thought was very, very powerful, "I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them among the countries, and they shall know that I am the Lord." And that comes from Ezekiel 30:26. And so you have a few other statements here, scriptures that you pull from the Bible. So I thought it was very powerful Because
Yes.
when we think about that history, we think about the Hebrews, who also you talk about, and we're going to get into, a little bit into that. Were also some of them were also Egyptians, and so you have the Hebrews and the Egyptians who were supposedly be led out of Egypt by the Moses. But anyway, we're going to get into some of that detail later. So anyway, I just thought it was very interesting. Do you want to expand more on that?
Yeah, the fact that you kept using the term Hebrew,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very interesting mention right here, and I may be getting off the path and going on. But the name Hebrew,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to emphasize the lineages of our own people, which are not emphasized. It comes from the continent. The Hebrew, they have the people of Nigeria who are called Hebrew now. I'm slip this in here. They were called Hebrew. That word itself, from Hebrew, evil, and that's around IGBO. The people in Nigeria who are to the western coast, across from the Atlantic Ocean, the evil people. I did a lot of work on them at one point, and they're legends. There are legends among our people that we knew. The legends among the people who are right here. I mean, the lineage people who are on the continent of Africa right now.
Right.
As today. They are legends, and the legend is that the Evos, which later became Hebrew in the name, were pushed out of their land, and they migrated across the continent to come where they are now.
Okay.
And there is one legend that said in the process they were born away from the herbs that grew in their areas, and the herbs that were there would allow them to do mummification. And I want to get into that because it's another.
Well, yeah, we're gonna go on into that too, because I think but that's your primary thesis. I think
Yes.
you have like a primary and then secondary, other theses, but I think that's the primary goal of your book, was to
See, rather than say that was all this that happened to us a curse, and I don't like the word curse. There's no redemption there. But if we say it was a penalty and that there is a higher power than human, we know that because there's always a reference to God.
Right.
So what in our journey as a people was resulted from the Creator's decision or from God, rather than from humans, man. The white man did this. We have all these discussions, and 90% of the time we're going to come to the conclusion that what happened to, we're going to use these terms, black people, is that the white man envied what they had. So therefore, that is what the intrusions and the rape of our continent, everything that happened to us because we were envied. And so we were envied to the extent that someone had to invade our lands and put us on ships and defeat us in that way. We're negating all along the way that there's something higher than human life, higher than man, in quote, than just circumstance.
Right.
And how much of that was a deed of man? Did the white man, in quote, really have the power to put the ships together, put us on them, and build us across the ocean? How much power are we given?
Right.
To something outside ourselves when we say that the transatlantic resulted from people's jealousy of our position, and to give that much power to, I use the word in the quote, white man, because that's how basically it's been put, on the most understandably, that we can exchange that.
So basically, so we do have. So what I hear is you saying is that you're saying that there's a higher power that has to play a role in the fact that in this devastation or this maafa or this catastrophe that African people faced. So you're saying there had to be something else other than just the white man. There's something else that was more in power. And so, because
we should refrain from giving all that power to a human element such as the white man.
Okay.
That kind of power.
Right. And so basically you're saying that the what happened to African people who were dispersed throughout Africa and the diaspora started with the disbursement with Egypt, I think in when the Greeks and Romans came in. So a lot of that disbursement started then. And then later on in our history, because African people had been dispersed from the Nile Valley after.
I'm not saying that it started in Egypt. I'm not saying that it started there. I'm saying that the fact of it, because I'm talking about the fact of it rather than the beginning of it. We were in the Nile Valley, but I'm saying that I'm not going to give that to. I'm not saying that.
Right.
In Egypt, when the Hebrews, no, it's not that simple.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And it's not that close to. It's many thousands of years we're talking about.
Yeah, so many thousands of years of us being dispersed, basically.
That's right. I mean,
right.
Anyway,
because we know we know historically, the Greeks came in, the Romans came in, and then after that, then 1,400 years later, you have the transatlantic slave trade. But all throughout that time, you had the the Islamic, conquest. So you just had a constant coming in of people from outsiders coming in, and we're being dispersed all over the continent. And then eventually it culminates into the Atlantic slave trade, and then now we find ourselves in America. So we are the Nile Valley people who have been dispersed over
thousands of years.
Right.
It's clear because we don't really. I mean, it's in prophecy.
It's
in biblical text, but none of the clergy, and I understand, ever talk about that aspect.
Right.
That there are prophecies that say, "I will scatter the Egyptians and disperse them through the lands," very clearly.
Right. I have here one here, but he said, "But I will scatter them with a whirlwind among the nations whom they knew not." And that was from Zechariah 7:14. So, yeah. So okay. So we got that. So now, the significance of knowing that is for us to know where we came from and to know the greatness we came from. So, because ancient Egypt ancient Kemet was one of the most wealthy and powerful nations of the ancient world, and so it's a good thing for Black people in America and Black people all over the world to know that. And we'll come back to some of that later too.